Hi everyone, this is the next set of notes that you are doing for our literary periods unit. These notes are called Elements of Literature. It's basically the parts of a story. It's going to be all the little things that you think of when teachers ask you to analyze a story, what the stories are made of. So you can write this for your essential question in literary analysis. How are various elements of literature interconnected? So the first thing you want to kind of think about is what are the various elements of literature? So think back to what makes up a story. Well, a story is going to need to have things like characters, a plot, and in order to have a plot, they need to have a conflict, a problem that they need to deal with. And then you also need things like the point of view that the author has that they're trying to reveal through the story. Might also need a theme, which is the central idea of the story that reveals something about what the author believes is an important truth about life or about human nature. We'll start by talking about plot, and that is essentially the story itself. What is happening in the story? How is the story presented? So you might remember, throughout middle school and probably in your English classes, freshman and sophomore year, plot is essentially the plot diagram. But as you can see in the literary period's PowerPoint, in that particular video, a lot more of the later literary periods, the more modern literary periods, we're talking about post-war, confessional, and postmodern periods, a lot of the authors are breaking rules. So instead of following a very succinct chronological order with a clear beginning, middle, and end, or, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution, now we're just really concerned with the structure of the plot itself. How is the plot being presented to us? How is the story being presented to us? So important thinking points for you to talk about plot and plot development is to consider first how the author began the story. The first sentence, the first paragraph, the choices that the author is making for the beginning of the story. And what is the conflict in the story? Because the conflict is what drives the character to move from one part of the story to another, one event to another. There are 3 different types of conflicts that we're kind of looking at. Character versus another character versus some sort of force, like the force of nature or of time, technology. Or perhaps the conflict is the character versus themselves. If the character is having some sort of problem internally, it's going to be something that's within their heart or within their brain. By that I mean some sort of moral issue. So feeling like they did something that's in the gray area between what's right and what's wrong. Perhaps it's an emotional conflict. So something traumatic has happened to them. Or perhaps it's even a spiritual, theological, or religious experience in which they're having a conflict with, a problem with. In thinking about the structure, there are different categories that we can look at. Perhaps the structure is chronological. It does have a clear beginning to the middle to the end. A lot of stories these days, especially with more of the contemporary literature, will also be episodic, which means think of like a sitcom. Some examples would be South Park, Family Guy, those types of stories. They don't, maybe sometimes within an episode or 2, there would be a story arc. But outside of that story arc, one episode is about that particular theme in that episode. And then another episode has a different theme, even though it's the same characters. Perhaps the structure is a frame structure. A frame structure means that there is a story within a story. And then maybe the structure is something else entirely, in which case you'll have to just, again, look at whether it's linear storytelling or non-linear storytelling. So the last thing you want to consider in terms of plot is the ending. When you're looking at the ending, you want to consider two things. Was the conflict resolved, and what was the outcome of the story? A lot of the more contemporary stories will not resolve its conflict. They're leaving the story open-ended. And then perhaps the outcome of the story itself is just that the characters have been changed in some way. So you'll just try to figure out what has changed by the end of the story, even if the conflict wasn't particularly resolved. So another element of literature we're talking about is style. Style has to do with structure in a different sense. This is the structure of the writing itself, not specifically the plot. So we're talking about the aesthetics of the words on the page. So in terms of style, you'll look at sentence style. Maybe the sentences are very, very long. If you've ever read something by William Faulkner, he's often known to be one of the writers who likes to use one sentence that goes on for a page or even 2 pages. Certain authors use very short sentences. Ernest Hemingway being one, he is known to be an author who really likes to cut out as many words as possible in his writing. It's almost poetic in the way that he does it. Maybe the sentence style, a lot more common, would be that they're mixing up between long sentences and short ones. And for that commonality, you'll really look at which sentences are the short ones, because if they're short, that means they're probably pertinent, if they're especially a short sentence within many long sentences. Style also refers to tone. When we're talking about tone, we are talking about word choice. Why did the author choose to use one particular word instead of another word when there are so many synonyms for that word in the English language? And with that, we're really looking at connotation. How does the word feel? What are some images that are conjured up when an author chooses to use one word instead of another? What are the details that are shared with us in terms of sensory imagery? And then, is there humor or sarcasm being used? If that humor or sarcasm is being used, is it being used in a cynical way or in an optimistic way? So in terms of talking about humor, one of the ways in which authors use humor is irony. There are 3 types of irony: verbal, dramatic, and situational. Verbal irony is when the words that are said are the opposite of what's meant. That's sarcasm. Earlier today, it was very rainy. But if I was being sarcastic when someone asked me, hey, what was the weather like outside? And I was like, oh my gosh, it was super sunny. Then I am being very sarcastic because that was the opposite of what was actually going on. The expectation is that I would say it was really rainy, but I didn't say that. I used sarcasm. Dramatic and situational both also have to do with what's expected and what actually happens. So when the reader knows something that maybe a character in a play doesn't know, we're expecting that character to do something specific, but the character doesn't choose to do that because they're missing some sort of information. Situational irony is sort of similar in that sense too. The situation defies expectation. What is expected is not actually what happens in reality. So for example, when we say something like the fire station is on fire, we would expect a fire station to be the place of ultimate fire safety. Unfortunately, if it is on fire, then it defies our expectation. It doesn't seem to be that safe after all. There's also symbolism and allegory that we're looking at. when we're looking at the elements of literature. Symbolism is basically just some sort of element, some sort of part of the story stands for more than itself. That can be an object in the story. So we're talking about something like, what does the apple represent in the original Genesis Adam and Eve story? Names can also be symbolic. Settings can be symbolic. The weather can be symbolic. So again, if it's rainy weather, then perhaps something bad is going on. Or if it's very, very hot weather, usually that signifies anger. Pretty much anything can be symbolism. And so as you do more literary analysis, you start thinking about all the little things within the story that might actually stand for something else. Allegory is a little bit more complicated in the sense that the entire story itself is a symbol. So if you've ever read the story Life of Pi, that is an allegory, because the story, even though it's about this kid and this tiger on this boat, the story itself underneath, the underlying meaning, isn't really about that at all. It was really about faith and religion. So a lot of people even wonder, was that tiger real? Is that story real? Maybe the story itself is just representative of something else that the character was going through religiously. Some sort of internal conflict that he was having. Theme, of course, is very important as well. It's the central meaning of the work. It's why the author even bothered to write all of this story down to begin with. So it's so important that you have to express it in a complete thought. And you have to consider, what is that truth that the author knows and wants to share with us, that they're exposing to us through their story, through their characters? Is it that humans are all very scarred underneath? Or maybe that everyone is afraid of the afterlife? Things like that, those ultimate truths or questions that the author is thinking about throughout their story. Characters really drive the story as well. We gotta have characters for us to be able to relate to the story. Who are they? What are they like? What are their goals? What are their motivations? And then again, what is the author telling us about people or life through the characters? What is that theme that the characters are leading us towards as well? When we're talking about point of view, it's easy to talk about whether the story is first person or third person. First person tends to use, the narrator uses the pronoun I. Third person, they're using the pronoun he, she, they, it. All right. Third person limited means that we only get the feelings and thoughts of one or two characters, just some major or minor character. Third person omniscient means that we're getting the story and the character's thoughts and feelings from multiple characters. And then third person objective is that it's almost like a documentary in a sense, that it's very objective. So think about like a reality show where the camera is just stationary and it's exposing everything that's happening in that room. That's an objective story. But it's a little bit easier to think about perspective. Perspective and point of view are very similar, but instead of talking about whether it's first person or third person, we're really thinking about who that narrator is and what is it that they know, what it is that they're trying to share with us, and the knowledge that they have, how much of it are they hiding from us? Are they biased? Are they honest? Are they knowledgeable? Is this even a reliable narrator? And then the last thing we want to consider is context. So context means the circumstances in which the story was written. That's why we're talking about these literary periods. When we're looking at the literary periods, we're looking at the culture of the time, the history and the major historical events of the time. And also, we're often looking at the author's biography, what life events happen in the author's life that might influence the truth that they're trying to share with us. All right, that's the end of this video. Make sure you do your summary and questions in your Cornell notes.